What do you think the origins are for the gap? I mean, there's the art and the science, so maybe it's a little bit genetics, maybe it's our rat nature. What else, Wade? What else do you attribute the gap to?
We did a lot of research for this book. We interviewed dozens of psychologists and neuroscientists and people in the business world. And one of the bookend studies that we came across was one done by a professor in the University of Milan in Italy, a guy called Zach Estes. Zach Estes put a group of men and women in front of something called a spatial awareness test. It looks a bit like a 3D Rubik's Cube, and he asked them to solve a whole load of problems. He found when he did this test that the women scored much less well than the men. So he went back over the answers, and he also found, when he looked into it, that what was happening was that the women were skipping questions a lot more often than the men were. He went back to the group and he said, okay, no more skipping, you all have to answer all of the questions. When the women had to answer all of the questions, guess what happened? They did just as well as the men did. They had chosen to skip the questions because they didn't want to risk getting them wrong. And to some extent, that became a metaphor for us about the confidence gap. If you skip the questions in life, you are not going to score as well as you could do. And when we asked Zach Estes, so why is this? Why, knowing that they would get lower scores, why did the women choose to skip the questions? He said it was that there's this fear of failure. They didn't want to risk answering something that they weren't 100% sure they were going to get right. There are ways we nurture girls and boys from a very young age that tends to be different, not just us as parents, but it happens in elementary schools. We encourage, inadvertently, I think, girls to be more perfectionist and to take fewer risks and to screw up less. I mean, what busy teacher in a classroom doesn't want to know that they can rely on some group to color in the lines and be respectful and be quiet and not screw up and raise their hands when they've perfectly formulated the question or the answer? And because girls have some brain capacities that make it easier for them to do that, we are very good at reading rooms and we have high EQ, we're empathetic like that. We do it more naturally and then we get rewarded for doing it because we get praised for doing it. What a good girl you are. And then and it sets off a circle. And there's nothing wrong with being good, except for when it means that we are holding ourselves back and keeping our voices quiet. And when we get out into the real world, you have to be able to rock the boat a little bit. So I think, it's a combination of factors. There are lots of things that go into starting at a young age into feeding a process that tends to lead to this confidence gap.